the idea that America is the land of the free. That contradiction has been brought into full view. We heard the freeholder lay out the disparities in Mercer County, but we know that those disparities exist across the nation. And we know that the history of our country is such that those contradictions are not exceptions, but in fact the result of us building the nation true. That this blueprint has evidenced itself in the way in which the country is organized in our social, economic, and political arrangements. But we're at a crossroads. There is a moral reckoning in front of us. And we've confronted two moments, I would argue, historically, in which the nation had to make a choice about whether or not it was going to be a truly multiracial democracy. I'd like to think of the first moment is often called by historians as the second founding. This is the period of radical Reconstruction after the carnage of Civil War, war fought on the basis of slavery, all over the issue of slavery. And then we had an opportunity, a moment where we could actually organize our society based not on white supremacy, but where Black folk would be brought into the body politic and exercise the full rights of citizenship. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments passed. A notion, the modern understanding of the American nation state emerges during this period, right? The notion of liberty and citizenship transformed, right? Made more robust during this period. And what do we get in response to radical Reconstruction? It is a revolution in some ways of the very way in which we understand ourselves. We get a counter-revolution, as the historian David Blight reminds us, that the second founding brought forth a backlash. What was the content of that backlash? It had everything to do with the emergence of Jim Crow laws, racial apartheid in the South, another form of slavery called convict leasing. In other words, in the face of the choice of what kind of nation would we be, who do we aspire to be, the nation doubled down on its ugly commitments. Double down on the idea, as I wrote in Democracy in Black, that white people ought to matter more than others. You see, at the heart of the American project is a lie. This idea that we are the shining city on the hill, as Ronald Reagan put it, this idea that America is an example of democracy achieved, that is and has been a lie. Why? Because that democracy was born, as I've mentioned, right, birth in the context of a society committed to the evil, the cruelty, the barbarity of slavery. And here, in this moment, in the second founding, the nation has an opportunity to imagine itself apart from that lie. But the serpent wrapped around the legs of the table, right, was denied, right? Instead, they doubled down on the ugliness. That's the first moment, crossroads. We failed miserably. The second moment, often by historians, is described by historians as the second Reconstruction, And that is the Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century. We typically tell that story in a narrow way, Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, the Montgomery bus boycott in 55, the emergence of Dr. King's voice. We talk about student sit-ins in the throughout the 1960s or 1960 in the organization and the founding of SNCC. We'll talk about that extraordinary moment in 1963 in the March on Washington, and somebody might mention 65 with the March on Selma. We talk about the legislation of 64 and 65 with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and then we jump to 68 and King's murder. And then we tell a story of decline, and that's the story of Black Power, where our rage and anger, right, took over. At least that's the story we tell. But in this moment, you see Black folk pushing for the nation to actually fulfill the promise of the first Reconstruction. But what do we get in response? We get calls for law and order, not just simply in the Nixon regime, but actually in Johnson. We get calls for law and order in response to peaceful protesters in the South, Right? If you read the Kerner Commission report, one of the features of that important report has everything to do with expansion of law enforcement, right? Expansion of policing, trying in some ways to police the very ways in which we, right, respond to our conditions of living. But what do we get in response to the second Reconstruction? We get this call for law and order that leads to the expansion of the carceral state. What else do we get? We get the Tax Revolt of California. What is that? Right, that tax revolt involved, right, the fate, white Americans responding to the face of poverty, becoming black. Some of you remember when Robert Kennedy went down to the Delta of Mississippi and he rubbed the face of that young black girl. And suddenly all of the policies of the New Deal became policies that were directed to black and brown people. The Great Society was read as this massive redistribution of wealth where government, bad government, would take, right, the hard-earned work of white people, the hard-earned earnings of white folk, and redistribute it to the lazy folk, these lazy black and brown folk, a tax revolt. What else did we see? We saw the hard hat rebellions, working class white folk. We saw this clamoring of the so-called silent majority. In other words, the nation in that moment in which we could finally reimagine ourselves as a truly multiracial democracy, double down on its ugly commitments. This idea of whiteness reasserted itself. The serpent threatened to swallow the whole thing whole. And here we are in this moment, facing a similar kind of reckoning, where the ugliness of our past and present made themselves known. 8 minutes and 46 seconds, as Officer Chavin in Minneapolis, Minnesota, had his knee on the neck of George Floyd. And of course, this moment is the result of the backlash against the election of Barack Obama. What did we get in response? Some people were saying with Obama's election, we had turned the corner. Right. But what did we get in response to Obama's election? We got voter suppression and voter ID laws, and then we vomited up Donald Trump. So again, in a moment where it seems that the nation could be otherwise, we double down on ugliness. Is that right? I think so, yeah. And now, with the public lynching of George Floyd, we find ourselves in this inflection point, right? At this crossroads, this inflection point, where we have an opportunity to imagine ourselves otherwise, I think. The ugliness of Donald Trump is in full view. But I want to insist, and I only have a little bit more time left, I think. I want to insist that we not exceptionalize Donald Trump, that we not, shall we say, displace all of our sins onto him and believe that if only we get rid of Donald Trump, then all of our problems will be solved. No. The protests that we're seeing all around the country and all around the world, or at least in the United States particularly, is not reducible to the last 3.5 years. The last 3.5 years is only an exaggeration of what we've been experiencing for the last 40 plus years. What we are witnessing, I believe, in this moment, and we could talk about this as it pertains specifically to Mercer County, is the kind of evidence of the contradictions and bankruptcy of a political and economic ideology that has had the nation by the throat for at least 40 years. What are we talking about? We're talking about the advent of Reaganism in 1980, right? And why would I go all the way back there? Well, think about it. The last major piece of legislation that was passed, a part of the Great Society, was, I think, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. As flawed as it was an attempt to address, the reality of residential segregation and what followed from that. As Freeholder Frisbee just laid out, we are as segregated today as we were back then. Right? 12 years later, just 12 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, the country elected Ronald Reagan. And for those who were a part of the Black Power movement, Ronald Reagan is as notorious as George Wallace, given what he did as governor of California. So when the nation elected Ronald Reagan as the kind of redeemer in chief, it was a backhand slap to the face of Black America. And what did Reagan represent? Not just simply his presidential campaign speech in Neshoba County, the place where where Goodwin, Schwerner, and Cheney were murdered. Not just simply that, right? But Reagan represented an ideology of whiteness, right? Wrapped in the charm of a Hollywood B movie actor. Sounds familiar, yes? Instead, we have a reality show actor now. And what did he do? He introduced an ideology that fundamentally upended, right, our basic conception of the public good. Reaganism was part of a broader economic and political philosophy. We might call it neoliberalism in London or Britain. It was thought of as Thatcherism. But what did it involve? It involved changing the emphasis in our economy from the stakeholders to shareholders. It involved, in some ways, taking the knees out from under everyday ordinary workers as they bust their behinds to make ends meet, but still barely keep their noses above water. So what have we seen since the 1980s? We've seen the destruction and the erosion of union representation in our country as workers continue to slide into deepening states of precarity, trying to make ends meet, not being able to make a living wage, working 40, 50 hours a week and still having to make choices about whether or not they could pay the rent or put food on the table. We see tax cuts that had everything to do with extraction of resources from everyday ordinary people, working people, and transferring that monies to the rich. So we get a deepening divide. That wealth gap that Freehold Frisbee talked about, right, was exacerbated by the Reagan years. Tax cuts that involved an evisceration of the social safety net as what? You had a rhetoric designed, right, to tell that government welfare programs became entitlement programs where bad government infringed upon the liberties of white folk and engaged in the redistribution of wealth from those who worked hard to those who just simply wanted a handout. Black folk were just simply, engaged in a discourse of victimization. This is the Reagan year. These are the Reagan years, right? Arguments about being tough on crime, a form of policing rooted, right, in a certain set of assumptions about communities. What this tough on crime bound up with this discourse of a law and order kind of frame that has everything to do with the response to keeping us in our cages. This tough on crime approach, right, finding its most forceful articulation in the war on drugs. What happens as a result? You get a race to the bottom in terms of the criminal code as Democrats and Republicans try to prove that they are the toughest on crime. And so we get this expansion of the criminal code that's where you can damn near sneeze and break a law in the country. What else do we see? We see the militarization of the police as military-grade weaponry transferred to local police departments and deployed in our communities. So you get an expansion of the criminal code, you get the militarization of police, and what do you get? You get the expansion of police itself, right? Where you get these large armies that in some ways occupy cities, right? There's an aggressive form of policing that emerges out of the framing of tough on crime that presupposes the inherent criminality of our communities and the inherent criminality of Black and brown peoples, and is parallel with the expansion of incarcerating Black folk, putting us in jails, putting us in prison, keeping us under surveillance, right? And so you end up with communities that are over-policed, over-surveilled, over-policed, and underprotected. These are the Reagan years. In the midst of the debates around George Floyd, what we can begin to say, the debates and the protest, is that George Floyd's murder, public lynching, yes, right, is the response has been a layer of accumulated grief and accumulated suffering. That the response is not just simply to his murder. George Floyd has become a kind of synecdoche, a part for the whole, a kind of point of entry to a country that feels like it's broken. And young people are in the streets precisely because of that. These are young folk who put everything on the line in 2014 when you had a black man in the White House and you still had the murder of Mike Brown for what? Walking down the middle of the street. That's that criminal code I'm talking about that increases the likelihood of our encounter with police. And whenever police are involved in an encounter with everyday ordinary citizens, we must remember that they have the capacity to use legal deadly force, as we just saw last night with Rashad Brooks in Atlanta, right? But these young folk put everything on the line in 2004, right? And confronted the military greed of the military weaponry of the police. And what happened? Nothing, for the most part. Nothing changed. Just think about it. In March of 2020, the police killed as many folk in March of 2020 as they killed in March of 2019, COVID-19 notwithstanding. Those young people who put everything on the line have come of age in a moment of catastrophe and disaster. Hurricane Katrina, the Great Recession, mass school shootings, global pandemic, and now this. No wonder they're clamoring for a different America, because they know that America as it is broken. Is broken. In this moment of profound transition and possible transformation, we are experiencing a moral reckoning at the national level, at the state level, and at the local level. We have to imagine ourselves differently. James Baldwin writes that he wants us to do something unprecedented, to imagine, to create a self without the need of enemies. Can we begin to imagine an America where white supremacy no longer reigns? Can we imagine an America where all of her people have not only the right to dream dreams, but can make those dreams a reality? We stand in the breach. And what we cannot tolerate in this moment are people who are more interested in safety and comfort than going big in the midst of the transition. What I've tried to suggest to you is that what we are experiencing is the collapse of a political ideology. Ronald Reaganism is broken. It is bankrupt, and Trumpism is just an exaggerated version of that. And if we're going to change the way in which we live our lives, we cannot tinker around the edges. We can't allow them who are engaged in bad faith debates get us distracted when we talk about defunding the police, when they know what we mean is transforming the very way in which we think of public safety in this country. That we can actually begin to address what is happening in resource-deprived communities. Notice how the adjective I use, resource-deprived communities, by investing in communities. What does it mean that the city of New York spends $6 billion on policing? One of the largest police forces in the world. What would it mean to transfer those funds, to redeploy those funds into housing and mental health and into employment and education? What would it mean for resource-deprived communities to begin to think of a public infrastructure of care instead of an emphasis on policing and incarceration, keeping us in our cages or keeping us in our place? Lord, we are grappling with the burden of our history. We have to go big. Too many people have put their bodies on the line to open up this space. We can't allow folk who are actually invested in the status quo, who are committed to a notion of civility more than they are to an idea of justice. We can't tinker around the edges. We have to fundamentally reimagine who we are. As I argue in my new book, we have to begin again. And this involves encountering our history. I'm going to come to a close, but I wanted to read some passages from the new book, if you don't mind. We see.
You don't have to come to a close. You better keep going, because you just took us to church, so just keep going.
I'll just read on this, Ms. LaRue, and then we can, because I would love to have the dialogue. Because, it's interesting to show you that the public lynching of George Floyd wasn't just simply about policing. Protesters are vandalizing and toppling Confederate statues. They are literally attacking the built environment that actually reflects what I've called the value gap. Got that statue in Richmond, Virginia, celebrating that racist Robert E. Lee. You got the statue of Robert E. Lee still in Emancipation Park in Charlottesville, Virginia, where Heather Heyer was murdered. And Stonewall Jackson, and you got slave auction blocks. And you see protesters really trying to, in some ways, address the haunting of our history by literally saying, you are celebrating these folk and we want a different America. So we're going to rid ourselves of this iconography, this symbolism of hate, this ideology to a lie. Because we know that the statues were put up because of the lost cause. We know that the monuments were in some ways a way of terrorizing Black folk as we were being put down by Jim Crow laws. We know that the monuments and statues and the tributes to the Confederacy was all about a response to our pressure from below as we were trying to break the back of racial segregation in the 1950s. And as racial apartheid was sedimenting in the 1890s and the turn of the century, 20th century. We know it's a lie, but history haunts. There's a wonderful passage that Baldwin wrote that I want to read to you. He says, and this is in response to a reporter in Esquire who was asking him about the urban rebellions. And the reporter asked him, he says, how can we get the Black people to cool it? And Baldwin said, it's not for us to cool it. And then the reporter says, but aren't you the ones who are getting hurt the most? And Baldwin says, no, we are only the ones who are dying fastest. The reporter didn't get what Jimmy was trying to say in that moment, that the burden of transforming this country has everything to do with white folk leaving behind this idea of whiteness. Let me be clear. I make a distinction between white people and those people who happen to be white. Those people who happen to be white are those folk who are grappling with this ideology of whiteness, who are trying to be anti-racist in their day-to-day lives. They understand that white supremacy functions for us like language. It comes to us as easily as words. So they're engaged in this ongoing work of deconstructing it as they try to imagine themselves differently. And then there are white people who are committed to the idea that whiteness ought to accord people distinct advantage. And you have to make a choice. Which side are you going to be on? And Baldwin was insisting on this with regards to the reporter, but then he makes a point about history. He says, I'm not trying to accuse you, you know. That's not the point. But you have a lot to face. All that can save you now is your confrontation with your own history, which is not your past, but your present. Nobody cares what happened in the past. One can't afford to care what happened in the past, but your history has led you to this moment. And you can only begin to change yourself and save yourself by looking at what you're doing in the name of your history. So this is what I've written at the end, near the end of the new book. And I'll read this and then I'll shut up and we can talk. Beginning again, or doing one's first works over, involves concrete efforts and stories to bring into reality a new America. You know, we're facing these two critical moments of moral reckoning where we face the daunting challenge of beginning again. And now we find ourselves facing a moral reckoning of the same magnitude. We should have learned the lesson by now that changing laws or putting our faith in politicians to do the right thing are not enough. We have to rid ourselves once and for all of this belief that white people matter more than others, or we're doomed to repeat the cycles of our ugly history over and over again. George Santayana, the Spanish-born American philosopher, was right to point out that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But what he didn't say is that those who willfully refuse to remember become moral monsters. What we need is a third American founding, third American founding. To begin again without this insidious idea of the value gap that continues to get in the way of a new America. We need an America where becoming white is no longer the price of the ticket. Instead, we should